everyone, we're here for another instalment of 10-Minute Takeover. Today we're going to be talking about the recent developments with R&D tax credits and how those have a bearing and impact in terms of tech companies. We're going to phrase that in terms of the good, the bad and the ugly, and discuss those in a bit more detail. Today I've got Jonny Brewster, head of R&D for THG with me, and we're going to explore some of those themes in a bit more detail. So Jonny, we know that there was a recent release, HMRC recently released some guidance in December 21 after the October budget. Take us through some of the implications that arose as a result. So what was the good news as a result of the budget release?
Yeah, let's start with the good news, right? So the R&D rules have been around for years, but they've been horrendously outdated, right? So companies haven't up until now been able to claim for the costs of cloud computing and data and those kind of things. From April 2023, HMRC have pledged that they're going to increase or extend the qualifying categories to allow those costs to be included in R&D claims as well, which is potentially sizable for businesses that are spending huge amounts of stuff on hosting fees and server costs and the like that can now potentially be brought into claims.
Excellent. So that's going to have a huge bearing in terms of a number of the tech clients that we look after, and that means what in terms of increased qualifying expenditure? What does that mean for individuals and for the companies?
Absolutely, yeah. So to the extent that you can include those costs in your claim, loss-making companies can surrender those costs associated with that spend and could get an extra 33% of that spend back as cash from HMRC. There's one or two little kind of quirks that we get to see in the legislation that as when it's released in spring this year. Things like how do you allocate what's the R&D use versus what's the commercial use? If you're going to resell the data or package it up in another way or license it to somebody else, then it's explicitly excluded. So there are a bunch of considerations, but in the main, it's good news and extending the eligibility of R&D costs.
Excellent. So the good news is obviously that there's potential upside in terms of the ability to claim additional R&D in the future, leading to higher claims for UK-born businesses. Excellent news for tech companies. Take us through the bad news. What were the recent updates that potentially had a bearing for specifically tech companies in the recent release?
Yeah, so HMRC have, whether it's HMRC, but there's been some analysis done that essentially says that a good part of the R&D support that has been provided to businesses doesn't remain within the UK. So the line from HMRC was something along the lines of refocusing where the credit is aimed at towards UK-based expenditure. So they're looking at refocusing the UK relief in line with other jurisdictions such as Australia and effectively wholesale disallowing any overseas activities from being included in R&D claims, which is potentially catastrophic if you've got a limited UK presence and all of your development spend happening overseas. But for one reason or another, then you could be about to lose the vast majority of your R&D claim from April 23.
Understood. So HMRC are basically almost curtailing and stopping the ability to claim overseas expenditure in its entirety. We've talked on a number of instances around if there's any planning that can be undertaken, but as we've discussed, I think those seem to be limited at the moment.
Yeah, so at the latest consultative committee meeting chaired by HMRC, that HMRC's opinion was that the focus is on where the activity is rather than the arrangements. So even if you contract with a UK-based subcontractor to do your R&D, but that work is subsequently undertaken overseas, that work is then not eligible for UK R&D relief.
Yeah, I guess this then has a bearing on companies' decisions going forwards, and therefore a decision needs to be made in terms of do they continue to develop their technology overseas versus actually bringing that kind of to the UK and then claiming on and then including R&D tax credits as well.
Absolutely. So there's kind of a couple of layers to that, isn't there? So absolutely, if you bring all your R&D to the UK and claim for your R&D within the UK, then absolutely you can include it within the claim. But naturally, one of the reasons that you might have an overseas development centre or your work done overseas is because the cost of labour is cheaper in a different jurisdiction, and therefore bringing it to the UK might mean you get a better R&D claim, but actually you might have a more significant outlay on other costs, and so your net cost might be higher. Over and above that, HMRC have, again in the latest consultative committee, they flagged that they would potentially be willing to consider arrangements where it was necessary for the work to be undertaken overseas. So in the Australian regime, for example, you have to go through a number of tests to prove that you couldn't get that work done in the UK. There either isn't the capacity or isn't the skill set or the kind of a dedicated resource that you need to engage with. At the moment, there's nothing written down about that. It's just HMRC's opinion, but hopefully that will carry through.
Yeah. So what we're saying is actually, whilst guidance has been published, the further, that will be discussed further over the coming months, and actually we can provide further updates as and when that becomes available.
Yeah.
The point that you're raising there is a genuine concern for tech companies. So at this point, it's probably a good inflection point to think about, actually, is now the right time to continue with your overseas operations as they currently stand, but you are more likely than not going to be able to claim R&D tax credits on those, versus bringing that tech development on into the UK and then being able to claim R&D tax credits. Almost an analysis to determine what the opportunity cost is and the difference between the two, and actually which is more beneficial. Now that's just looking at it through a tax lens, and obviously there's so many other overriding factors in terms of actually the teams and commercial overdrivers that would need to be considered as well. So we're only looking at this almost one-dimensionally at the moment.
Absolutely.
And Johnny, the final section that we've got to cover today, the ugly. What are the ramifications from HMRC's guidance in relation to that final area that we said that we'd cover?
Absolutely. So calling it out, right? So HMRC's latest accounts had essentially a black hole of just north of £310 million, where they believe they have overpaid R&D tax credits back to businesses. That's a combination of intentional fraud, let's call it out, and accidental increases in claims or claims that were filed incorrectly via that. Whether it's mistakes made in not diving too deeply into what makes up your R&D claim, not interrogating whether you're SME or large, or not understanding particular or kind of complex arrangements that might trip you one way or the other. We've seen claims through our diligence process where we've taken on new R&D claims, or through new investment rounds, we essentially look back at prior R&D claims and flag that actually claims claims that have been pulled together by advisors are wrong, claims that have been pulled together in-house are wrong, claims that have been pulled together sometimes by advisors are potentially intentionally over the top, and things that have been included absolutely shouldn't be included, but the company themselves might not be aware, and they've been promised a particular repayment by an advisor, and that advisor is engaged on a success-based fee, which means the more they can throw in the pot, the more their fee ends up. So there's a level of self-interest there that is sometimes potentially challenging to overlook, right? And so that's what HMRC are keen to crack down on. It's those claims that are filed intentionally incorrectly.
Yeah.
So absolutely, there's a number of firms out there, a number of businesses out there that don't have tax experience, that don't have R&D experience, that don't appreciate the quirks that are within the R&D legislation and lead to incorrectly filed R&D claims.
Okay, understood. So this is not just an attack in terms of, or a defensive measure in terms of some of the providers in the R&D space that let's just using the analogy that we had before, the kind of cowboys in the R&D space, right? So it's not just those, but also a defensive measure for companies that are claiming their own R&D tax credits and making sure that they're working with providers to ensure that all the kind of sensitive areas have been considered and they're not therefore over-claiming or actually claiming under the wrong regime.
Absolutely. So this is essentially but the latest step in a journey towards regulation, right? So there is nothing that prevents companies from filing their own R&D claims, and many do it, and many do a pretty good job of it. But actually, as we've talked through before, in the good and the bad, right, the regulations are going to get more quirky rather than less, and therefore companies are going to need to have a high level of R&D knowledge to ensure that their claims they make themselves are filed accurately, to avoid falling foul of HMRC's increased scrutiny. So HMRC they're recruiting 100 new inspectors right now, and that is going to raise the level of scrutiny generally. But equally, there's going to be a specific focus on, as you put it, cowboys, where HMRC suspect claims are overinflated or have reason to believe that areas of claims have been included and shouldn't be. And certain advisors will build up certain reputations with HMRC, and they will naturally have a propensity to look at those claims in a bit more detail.
Okay, interesting. So that's kind of HMRC developing a black book of individuals who they know kind of have historically potentially put, overly inflated claims through.
And that's going to be identifiable because from April 23, all our R&D claims that are made under the latest updates should include the name of the advisor that's been helping the company make the claim, if relevant, and also a named individual from within the company that's taking accountability for the claim as well.
That's interesting. So if you're not providing, then again, I guess at that point, if you're not providing the name of a provider, again, that leads to higher levels of scrutiny, because it's kind of that self-review threat, but also making sure that you have, that you are working with someone that understands the complexities of R&D. I know that in the past that we've talked about this as well, that there is, there are a number of more complex areas that scaling technology companies need to consider, given either their investment portfolio or given their investment, given state aid funding. There's a whole raft of areas that they could actually trip up on, and therefore, this does need to be considered in more detail.
Absolutely.
Jonny, thank you so much for today. Again, we've covered those areas in terms of those recent kind of HMRC release guidance. I think, as we've said before, there's going to be further information that's going to be forthflowing in the future. And what we'll do is make sure that you're updated as further information is released. So, Jonny, thank you so much for going through the good, the bad, and the ugly with us today. And we'll see you again soon. Thank you so much. Bye for now.